Well, hello everybody. Welcome to another video on History Vibe Podcast. I am joined by Dennis McDonald and Gary Greenberg. And today we're going to be discussing a bit about, their different views on biblical characters like Judas Iscariot or Mary Magdalene. And we're going to talk a little bit about their different views on pre-Markan sources. So like Dennis McDonald's Q plus versus Gary Greenberg's Alpha Gospel. And so this is kind of a part two. Basically, it is a part two to their debate that they had on the show several months back. And so we're just going to be continuing from there. So Dennis and Gary, thank you both for joining me today in person.
Thank you.
Yeah, and so let's get this show right on the road. So Dennis, I want to go with you first. Can you give a brief recap to those that might not have seen any of your previous appearances at all, or even know about your books? What is Q plus? Can you give a brief summary about how you view Q differently from other scholars?
Well, first of all, the beginning of Q research happened early in the 20th century by scholars who recognized similarities in passages in Matthew and Luke that resembled each other that they didn't have in common with Mark. And the question was, where did they get the common material? One proposal was that Luke knew Matthew and Mark, and therefore the overlaps with Matthew were simply Luke's use of Matthew. Others noted, however, that frequently Luke had content that was earlier than Matthew, and therefore it's likely they had a common source. So the way that Q research began was by isolating content between Matthew and Luke that had overlapping content against Mark, and to assess with rigid criteria which of the two preserved the saying with more fidelity. And it was that went into the Q document. There was also an impulse to eliminate all Markan influence because the initial understanding of Q was material in Matthew and Luke that they didn't share with Mark. So one tried to distill from Matthew and Luke everything that respective Mark and to remove it from the discourse. And so that's basically the origin of the Q document. It became clear to me and to others that Luke probably did know Matthew. And if he did know Matthew, then some of the parallels between Luke and Matthew could be assessed as Luke's use of Matthew, and maybe even quite creatively. Another major flaw was that Mark likely knows Q, because even after one removes all of the Markan influence on Matthew and Luke, you get doublets or conflations or examples where Mark still has parallels to Q. So it requires a new way of reconstructing the Q document. Now, another part for me is that I think that the Markan evangelists knew Homer and created narratives out of the Homeric epics, especially for characterizations of Jesus, but also of Mary Magdalene, of Judas and Peter, and so on. Once one establishes that, the parallels between Mark and Matthew and Luke become really more interesting because Mark has two primary literary antecedents. One is the Homeric epics, but the other is sayings that appear in Matthew and Luke as well. So that's called the Q plus Papias hypothesis. And the reason Papias falls into it is that he knew three Greek Gospels. One was attributed to Mark, already by his time, and two to Matthew, but as translations of Hebrew Matthew. So one of those Gospels is our Mark, more or less. Another is our Matthew, more or less. And the other is likely the Q document. And then I try to unpack that. The most important criterion for understanding the Q document is what I call reversed priority. And this has been a part of Q research from the beginning. Even if Luke knows Matthew, there are lots of sayings in Luke that are more primitive than what you find in Matthew. So that is not coming from Matthew. It probably is coming from a lost source. So that part of Q research is still valid. Another is Matthew sometimes has reverse priority to Mark. And Matthew was written after Mark, almost certainly. So when you have Matthew's reverse priority to Mark, he's not getting the content from Mark, he's getting it from elsewhere. Now, there are a lot of options for where you can get information. You can get it from oral tradition, you can get it from multiple sources, you can get it by accident. So all of that becomes pretty messy. But I've been working for 25 years on the synoptic problem. I'm giving a paper here in San Diego at a professional meeting on it tomorrow. And the name of my paper is Why is Q in Intensive Care?
Why is Q what?
In intensive care. Why is it so problematic for so many people? And why is the synoptic problem still not resolved? At least publicly resolved, or widespread resolution. And you've been working on that problem too. So that's the Q plus Papias hypothesis and a little history of the origin of the Q hypothesis.
Gary, could you tell us what the Alpha Gospel is for those that are not familiar?
Yeah. It's my thesis that there existed prior to Mark a full-scale biography of Jesus based on his acts, consisting of almost all the acts that we find in the Gospels, but not including most of the speeches. It was a biography, but the speeches may or may not have been in it, but I don't have the evidence one way or the other on speeches. And that Mark used most of the gospel, this prior gospel, in reconstructing his gospel. Mark had other sources, some of which were duplicative, and it resulted in a lot of re-editing that he had to do to make the two sources seem like they were separate events rather than the same stories. And that created some problems in his gospel. But the key thing that I get into is that John knew this gospel also. And so to a large extent, and John's position was that this gospel was terrible, this pre-gospel. It got Jesus all wrong, which means the synoptics, for the most part, from John's perspective, would have gotten Jesus wrong. And he wrote his gospel, or at least the core of his gospel, as a refutation of the pre-Markan gospel. So to a large extent, since Mark uses so much of that material in his own gospel, John's gospel can be seen as a refutation of Mark's gospel. I do also get into the fact that Luke also knew the earlier gospel and at various times has to make decisions with whether he goes with Mark or whether he goes with the earlier gospel, and does make some changes here and there on it. But it's harder to detect with him because he follows so much of Mark in his own gospel. So broadly speaking, that's the thesis. There was a pre-Markan gospel. Mark used it for his primary source. John knew the gospel, didn't like it, and rewrote that gospel to adapt to his own theology. And there are a number of things about John's gospel that explain why he differs so much from Mark's gospel. From the theological problems, because John's theology is radically different from the Synoptic Gospels. A particularly primary example is John's Gospel is a very simple statement. If you believe that that Jesus was sent by the Father to offer eternal life, then you'll receive eternal life. Anything else is wrong. So when the Gospels have incidents where someone says, how do you get to heaven? And they say, well, do you follow the 10 Commandments? Do you do this? Do you do that? Then you'll probably go to heaven, but then you have to do this also. John didn't like any of that. It was very simple. John didn't have any where the puzzling passages where Mark's giving them esoteric descriptions of what the kingdom is like, and John wants everything simple, and Mark says, well, I give this to you and I teach you separately because it's not for the others. John wants his gospel to be easily understood for everybody. So you have a lot of places. John doesn't want to have exorcisms as a reason for believing in Jesus, because exorcisms weren't unique to Jesus. Others were able to do exorcisms. Luke even has a description of that, where there's the example of how do you do exorcisms if you're not working with demons? And Luke says, well, how do your people do exorcisms without working with demons? So it was a well-known principle that other people did exorcisms too. And John doesn't want people to accept Jesus because of miracles. He wants them to accept Jesus because of the words he speaks. He says, my words prove to you that I'm telling you the truth, because I am not talking about my glory, I'm talking about the Father's glory. So that's the process that took place. John rejected the Proto-Gospel and wrote his gospel as a refutation. And so when you read Mark, you have to say, if John knew that story, would he have any criticisms of that story? And if he did, then he would be rewriting the story, and then you have to say, what kind of changes would he make to the story? And when you do that, then you begin to see how John knows the same stories that Mark does.
So it seems like, even though y'all have very different views on what this pre-Markan gospel is, and if Mark had other sources or not, I did notice that there is some similarities. You both agree that there are times of reverse priority, where Luke is using Mark, but sometimes Luke, for one reason or another, will defer to an earlier source when it suits him. In your case, it's the Alpha Gospel, Gary, and Dennis, in your case, it's Q+.
Well,
when his reverse priorities happening. But that's just something I just noticed right off the bat. That,
well, let me comment on that just briefly. First, we know Mark appears to have had a second source that had similar stories, but they weren't the same stories. He had to integrate them into his own gospel in a way. Particularly Mark 6 through 8, 2 bread miracles, 2 crossings of the sea, and so on and so forth. So when you get that, and he had to tell them in a way so that they didn't look like the same story. He wanted them to look different, and he moved things around, he changed things, he had to alter stuff. But Luke also says there's a lot of things out there. There's not just, I know a lot of different things. There are many stories, many witnesses, many writings, he implies. So there's a lot of stuff floating around, and they could have influenced a lot of things too. But I believe that there was this first major biography. Now, there may have been other things in addition that might have influenced that Proto-Gospel, but I also moved that Proto-Gospel much earlier in time. I think it preceded Paul. And if so, that makes a major difference to how the stories of Jesus progressed.
Do you do anything with the Luke-Matthew overlaps, and how do you explain those?
I don't. I didn't get into Matthew too much because I didn't find enough places where I could find parallels with Matthew and John against Mark.
Okay, could you give us an understanding of how you date these various Gospels?
How I did what?
Date them,
Okay, there's a couple of things in John, which seem to be earlier than Mark. For one, where Mark and the Synoptics have stories about Jesus saying, well, I have to be killed and then I will rise up. John merely has stories about Jesus saying he will rise, and that not that he has to be killed. And I think Raymond Brown, for example, talks about those being more primitive than Mark.
When would you date the composition of John?
Of John?
Yeah. Or actually, I want to know.
I can't do that per se because I think he's using the source, and I can't say when he started using the source. I think he's late, but then he went through editing. They were edited in different editions. Okay. So it's possible there was a core version of John's Gospel that may have been well earlier than we have it now.
I actually hold to that. I hold to that, but in a different way. When would you date Luke Acts?
I think Luke is very late 1st century or early 2nd century.
Okay.
One thing that I think doesn't get enough attention is that Luke seems to know a lot of Josephus, but seems to get him wrong a lot. But that Josephus seems to be the source for a number of things that Luke has written. And for that to be true, Luke has to be late.
Okay.
But John went through evolutions, and there's more than one version. There were redactors working on John, making changes, adding things. And I'm not clear myself on what part of the beloved disciple is early and what part is late, because John seems to be talking about a beloved disciple who was alive for a period of time and then has this problematic passage about the beloved disciple having died. And why do you complain about that? I will decide when these things should happen, and you shouldn't be complaining that the beloved disciples already died. So there are problems with that on chronology also.
Okay.
Dennis, how do you look at the formation of John? You have stated here that you agree with Gary in a different way about the multi-authorship of John's. It was written in stages, and then a canonical redactor put it all together.
It's been known for a long time, and this is probably what Gary's referring to, that the Gospel of John was composed in stages. The problem then is, what did the stages consist of? In which order were they done? And my model for it is a pueblo, an Aztec pueblo, where one structure is built on another and built on another, so that these strata are not arguing with each other, they're supplementing each other. And at each stage, they know the synoptics, especially Mark and Luke. The earliest gospel, in my view, is what I call the Dionysian gospel, is the one that includes Jesus turning water into wine. He's the true grapevine. He gives water to the woman of Samaria. And also this wonderful opening monologue in the Gospel of John, where Jesus is the Logos who's come and so on, which is really a refutation of Luke's infancy narrative. So you get this Dionysian impulse that's oriented toward miracle working, and a lot of those miracles appear in Mark already. So I agree with you at that point. The next stage seems to be an anti-Jewish stage, where Jews are accused of being Christ killers, basically. You are murderers from the beginning, and so on. Very hostile and nasty. And then the last is a nicer redaction, which I call the beloved disciple gospel. And that's where you have the reference to the beloved disciple. It's in this last redaction, and it ends with the author or authors saying that there are multiple gospels out there. We acknowledge Peter as the leader of the flock, but this is the gospel we like. And so at that point, it happens after the death of the beloved disciple, which I would place around 125 or 130. He must have been a very old man at that point. But that, I think you have to allow for the authors even early on knowing the Gospel of Luke, and if Luke knows Josephus, that pulls those dates late. That's why, Gary, I asked you how one would date these texts.
Well, you could see some stages in John from what I think is an interesting technique. John throws glosses in at various places.
That's right.
And it makes no sense for him to have done that.
Exactly. Yeah.
One place particularly puzzling to me, which I think proves his use of an earlier source, is he talks about circumcision having come from
Moses. But it comes from
But then he throws in a gloss saying, of course it wasn't Moses, it was the forefathers. And even that's wrong, because it came from Abraham.
Yeah.
And so John is not only using a source, but he's using a source twice removed.
Well, but he could be using an earlier version of the same gospel. Another example would be, and Jesus was baptizing more people than John. Of course, Jesus himself didn't baptize.
Right, that's another example
there are
of
lots
John
of them.
using a source where he's quoting the source first because it was probably well known. And then he says, of course, the real fact
But
is
I would
this.
not call it a
But
source.
why would he not just say the original thing?
I agree.
Rather than put the gloss in?
But I would contest that it's not a source, it's an earlier stage of the transmission of the Gospel of John. So I guess you could say it's a source of the next redaction. But but you're right about those insertions. You can see that it's layered for sure.
Yeah, so it certainly signifies changes are being made.
That's right.
Whether they're correcting John as you think or altering John, or I think he's correcting his source. But, you brought up one of your stages in which you talk about, say, a Dionysian stage. I'm not going to say that's wrong, but I am going to say that I use the water into wine incident to explain something very important about how John works. Mark has a story where Jesus goes to Capernaum and does an exorcism. It's his first miracle. And as a result of that miracle, Jesus became famous and widespread renown. That upset John tremendously from his theological perspective.
I agree.
And he wanted to change that. And when you look at John's gospel, he also has Jesus going to Capernaum, and then he suddenly breaks the story off and moves Jesus into Jerusalem, where you have the chasing of the money changers, a different story, which brings him fame and so on without a miracle. But he needs to get rid of the first miracle. And what he does is, just before Jesus goes to Capernaum, he has the wine into water, which almost nobody knows about. And he specifically says, that's the first miracle. He's emphasizing that what you heard about the first miracle is wrong. This is the first miracle, wine into water.
I would disagree with some of what you said, but the basic point you're making, I agree with. The first miracle in the Synoptics that Jesus performs is an exorcism in a synagogue. In the Gospel of John, the first one is giving wine to people who are already drunk at a wedding. Now that signals to you that Jesus is a donor deity.
Is a what?
A donor deity, and not just an exorcist and a party killer. So that part I agree with.
Yeah. So now it's certainly possible that you said there was a source that may have had that story. Now it's certainly possible John could have used that story for that purpose that I explained and may have adapted it. But I think I think it's an example of how John works around what's in the Synoptic Gospels and how he changes things around. And he uses the chasing of the money changers as a parallel to Mark's exorcism. You have a chasing out of a holy body.
Okay, I disagree with you a lot on that, Gary, because I don't think there's a source behind the changing of water into wine. I think it's Euripides Bacchae and the traditions about Dionysus changing water into wine that's widespread in the Greco-Roman world.
I'm a little confused about why you think that story might have not been out of here and adapted. I'm not saying the water into wine was in the Proto-Gospel. I'm saying he used that story from wherever he took it, either invented or otherwise, and used it for a purpose to say this was the first miracle, not the one you've been told about.
Well, I agree with that piece. I think we're probably disagreeing, and probably we should move on, about what we mean by a source.
Yeah.
Because I think a literary model is what I would probably...
I use source basically that it's something they know about and adapt for whatever reason.
Okay.
It could be a verbal statement. It could be a written statement. It could be a single story. It could be something they read somewhere. It could be a mismemory of something.
Okay.
But it could be any kind of number of things if it's something they think they know from somewhere else.
Okay.
I'd like to bring up Judas Iscariot, and I'll start with you, Dennis, on that one. Why do you think Judas didn't exist?
I'm going to try to do this briefly.
Mm-hmm.
The lists of apostles in Acts and in the Gospels all end with the name Judas, son of Jacob, son of James. Luke, though, has two Judases. One, Judas, the son of James, and the other is Judas Iscariot. Mark only has one Judas, but it's Judas Iscariot. So is Matthew. I think the Q document had a Judas, which is related to Judea and Judah, and so on. And he adds the epithet Iscariot, which means probably into the city, Iskariot, in Greek and Aramaic. Now, Paul knows a tradition that says that Jesus, on the night he was betrayed, Jesus, on the night he was betrayed, took bread. Now, the word paradidomi can mean either betray or handed up. And we don't know, it doesn't give a name. And it can even mean that God gave it up, depending on your theology, which I think is awful. And maybe there was a betrayer. Q doesn't know anything about it. Mark creates a character for the betrayal. And his model for it was Melanthius.
Was what?
Melanthius, who is a turncoat slave of Odysseus. And by the way, unfortunately, the name Melanthius means black. His sister's name is Melantho, a black woman, and their father is Dolios, which means deceitful one. So it's a slave family, presumably, in the Odyssey. In any case, he is a turncoat. He becomes a slave, really, of Penelope's suitors. When Odysseus comes back and reveals his identity, he brings him arms. And the penalty for Melanthius in his being a turncoat is that he's dismembered at the end of the story. In my opinion, the Gethsemane episode has the slave of the high priest losing an ear with the sword. I think that's another echo of Melanthius. Matthew comes along and he finds that whole idea is ridiculous.
Yeah, what?
He doesn't like the idea of the demonizing of Judas. So he has Judas commit suicide. You blame the chief priests, and therefore Judas is going to have a throne in the kingdom or whatever. That sounds outrageous by itself. But there are a number of other characters that seem to be created by attention to the Homeric epics. Mary Magdalene would be another. Peter is another in his betrayal, because you have a betrayer, a betrayer of sorts, named Eurylochus in the Odyssey. Now, most people don't know the Odyssey well. They read it in enjoyment, and they should. But it became a resource for the creation of narrative and characterization in antiquity. And I kind of made a career out of trying to trace those. So that's why I don't think... Now, I do think there was somebody named Judas, the son of Jacob. I think he became demonized as the betrayer because Mark knew a tradition about Jesus being betrayed. And it makes for good narrative. But I don't think there was a historical Judas Iscariot.
I wrote a full book-length study of Judas, arguing that the whole gospel accounts are wrong, that Judas in the earliest stages was not thought of as a villain, that there's a very different story behind it, and that, as you point out, initially the word for betrayal is also to hand over, and that the transformation came later. there was a handing over, but for a very different reason in a different context. And it was my argument that the high priest had brokered a deal between Jesus and Pilate to avoid any violent protests in the city. And the Herod was furious over this deal and demanded that Pilate break the agreement. And the agreement was that Jesus would go under house arrest for the period of the Passover and then be released after the Passover to go home, and he would guarantee that his disciples would not do anything troubling. They wanted to avoid a pogrom.
Okay. I find all of that is so implausible, Gary, I can't tell you.
Well, I can only tell you it's a complicated study, but I think I proved the point in my book that in the initial stages, and one particular clue is Matthew talks about Jesus promising 12 thrones to the apostles, and Luke corrects that to 11 thrones to account for Judas.
I agree with that.
And so I think that's a sign that originally Judas was not a bad guy. They changed him to a bad guy later on.
To that extent, I agree. But I don't think Mark knew anything about the death of Jesus except that he died.
I have to explain why things happened the way they did in the story, because the story, as they tell it, makes absolutely no sense. There is no historical validity to almost anything about the Passion account.
I agree with that. I agree with that.
Review the updated items on your screen.
My watch started arguing with me.
So now I'm going to shift to Mary Magdalene, because that's another character that you think did not exist in us. You want to tell us a bit about that?
Jesus' mother in the Gospel of Mark is Mary, and she has 4 sons in addition to Jesus. 2 are James and Joseph. There are 3 women who who watch Jesus die from a distance. 2 of them are named Mary, and one is Salome. One of the Marys is Mary Magdalene, which means Mary from Tower Town. Magdala is a tower, and it's a tower town. The other one is a woman named Mary who has boys who are named James and Joseph the younger. James the lesser and Joseph. Now, that can't be an accident. That there's something symbolic going on, but it's not Mary of Nazareth who watches her son die. It's 2 other Marys. The same thing's true of Joseph. If Mark knew a tradition that Jesus' father was Joseph, it's Joseph of Arimathea who buries Jesus. And Arimathea in Greek means excellent disciple, discipleship. So he's the one who buries. Now, in the Odyssey, in the Iliad, when Hector dies, there are 3 women who watch him die. One is his wife Andromache, one is Helen, and one is his mother, Hecuba. And they are watching from the tower of the wall in Troy. And they are also the ones who lead the lament when Hector's body finally comes back to Troy. And it's a very famous scene. So the other thing about these three women is that Mark does not treat them well. They come to anoint Jesus' body, even though it's already been anointed. They come to the tomb. It's empty. A young man in the tomb says, tell the disciples to go to Galilee. You're going to meet in the mirror. And they don't tell anybody. So what's the implication of that? The disciples stay in Jerusalem and they suffer in the Jewish war. And that's my reading of the end of Mark. So that the creation of Mary Magdalene is not about praise in Mark. It's about guilt. They're responsible for the disciples not having an encounter with Jesus in the end. And you have these three women in the Iliad who are watching the death and caring for the body and leading the lamentation. I just think it's fascinating. Here's another thing that's important about it. Apart from Mark, we have no indication of an appearance to Mary.
Of what?
Any appearance of Jesus to Mary. Paul doesn't know about it. It doesn't appear in the Q document. And every single reference to Mary Magdalene in the later tradition is derivative from Mark. You have no independent attestation to her. Now, could she have existed? Yes, but you don't need her existence to explain the narrative. So that's the argument.
John's Gospel, interestingly, in this context, takes the negative images of the mother and eliminates them. Where the Mark has, first a mother thinks he's crazy in one episode, and then in the later episode that she's separated out from her son in criticism. John changes all that. He eliminates all the negative images. For example, where they say, don't we know his mother and his son, and his brothers in the Synoptic, in Mark, putting them aside, separate apart from Jesus, as critical of Jesus. John doesn't even mention the mother. He just says, don't we know his father? And Luke says, don't we know his father also?
Well, and Mary Magdalene receives a very positive treatment at the end of the Gospel.
And in John, Mary is a very positive character.
That's right.
And interestingly, from my perspective anyhow, I think he has her after the crucifixion in the journey to Emmaus in Luke. There are two people who are kind of losing faith in Jesus because of what happened, and they're the first ones Jesus appears to. In John, he changes that all around. Mary Magdalene is the first one he appears to, replacing the two faithless ones, and Mary is faithful. And then later, in the ending part of John, there are disciples who are not sure who this character is who appears after the resurrection. Those are the two faithless ones that are unnamed and appear in the story.
Well, let me follow up with that by saying, at this point where I really agree with you, and maybe we should end our conversation with this agreement. I'm convinced that the author of the story of Mary Magdalene is actually using the story of Jesus on the road to Emmaus as the model. And it's because in both of them there is Jesus is in disguise, and there then is an anagonismus. There's a recognition, and there's an enlightenment and an expression of acceptance of the Lord. They found the Lord now. So I think the Mary Magdalene story is a spin-off of the story of on the road to Emmaus, and you can actually line them up pretty well.
Yeah, well, again, John does a lot of reversal of the road to Emmaus story. In the road to Emmaus, they get signs that Jesus must be real. If he eats the bread, a ghost couldn't do that. If he eats a fish, the ghost couldn't do that. Those episodes appear differently in John. Jesus has already made himself known before he eats the bread and the fish.
He exposes his wounds. In both of them, he exposes his wounds.
Right, but nobody touches it.
Right.
There's always the image that Thomas was putting his hand in, but Thomas stands in John.
Well, the background to this almost certainly is Odysseus coming back to see his father and showing, without a touch, showing the scar on his leg to prove that he is who he is.
Yeah. And John uses Thomas as a kind of a protection of the other apostles. In the Synoptics, the other apostles don't believe it's Jesus at first. In John, they all do except for Thomas. So Thomas absorbs all their guilt in the initial episode.
And of course, in Mark, they never see him. Yeah.
Well, Dennis and Gary, this has been a blast. Thank you both for joining me today for part 2 of the debate. And yeah, let's close out there. All right.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.